Good afternoon. As you know, the annual session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues opened this week. The session lasts 2 weeks and will cover a range of issues, including good governance, the Asian region, youth, health, education, culture, human rights, and the upcoming 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. To discuss issues related to the Asian region, we are pleased to have with us the re-elected member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for Asia, Mr. Raja Devashish Roy, on far left. He is the chief of the Chakma Administrative Circle and the traditional Raja of the Chakma peoples. He is also an advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh in Dhaka. In January 2008, he was appointed as a special assistant to the chief advisor, Government of Bangladesh, with the rank and status of a Minister of State. He was in charge of the Ministry of Chittagong Hill Tracts Affairs and the Ministry of Environment and Forests, and held these posts until January 2009. We also have with us Ms. Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, an Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She is the executive director of the Tebteba Foundation in the Philippines. She is also the convener of the Asian Indigenous Women's Network. A former chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2005 to 2009, she was appointed Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the Human Rights Council on the 8th of May 2014, succeeding Professor James Anaya. And also with us is Mr. Jiten Yumnam from the Meitei people of Manipur, Northwest India. Mr. Yumnam is Secretary of the Center for Research and Advocacy in Manipur. He conducts research and advocacy to promote sustainable development and the human rights of the indigenous peoples of Manipur and across Northeast India. He works against megadams and oil exploration and in favor of self-determined development. They will each make brief remarks and then we'll take questions. And I would like to begin by calling on Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy. The floor.
Thank you very much. It's very happy to be here. Just a few minutes ago, we concluded the half-day dialogue on the Asia region, and every year the forum has a focus on a particular region. This year it's Asia, and we're very happy that quite a number of governments from Asia took part in the discussion, and sometimes we don't have enough governments from Asia participating, so we are pleased with that. And as you know, that Asia is one of the fastest growing economies region-wise, and it also has the highest number of indigenous peoples and the highest indigenous population in the world. And some of these things came up in the discussion this morning and also yesterday and the preceding days. And I just wanted to mention some of the highlights of the issues that came up. Violence against indigenous women came out very, very strongly with reports of rape and sexual assault in several countries of Asia, and particularly in countries where there is a high military presence. The issue of militarization came up, as was also the case in the last half-day session on Asia some years back. And security laws, perhaps my colleague Jiten will speak more on that. Some of the security laws are used in a discriminatory manner against indigenous people. The issue of land came up as it does every year, and in the sense of lands, territories, and the natural resources thereon. And yesterday, actually, I gave a presentation on two best practice examples from the Philippines and Bangladesh. The Philippines one was with regard to titling of ancestral lands and domains by the National Commission. And in the Chittagong Hill Tracts case, there is a special tribunal, although it's called a commission, to resolve disputes over land. And it includes indigenous peoples and leaders as members of the commission. And this commission is actually a tribunal with the full authority of a civil court of law. And you do not need lawyers. The procedure is brief and quick, simple. But we have a problem with the law that some of its provisions are contrary to the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord of 1997, which stopped the violence there. The guerrillas came and entered into political agreement with the government of Bangladesh. But we have problems with this law. There are defects in the law to democratize it further, to make it more effective. So it has not been able to do its work. So there was a very strong calls from the different caucuses and from governments to urging the government of Bangladesh to make it more effective, to amend the law in accordance with the advice of the Chittagong Hill Tracts Regional Council, the premier body of the Hill Tracts. In the case of the Philippines, there were also very strong calls to strengthen the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples to make its work, particularly with regard to land titling, more effective. The issue of identity came up too, and only two governments in two states in Asia, as we know, use the term indigenous peoples in the constitution, Philippines and Nepal. The others use varying terminology, and some of these states are pragmatic that they use these terms as the national constitutions say, but also use the term indigenous peoples. Some have more difficulties with it and would not like to use the term, and this creates problems with regard to the actual implementation of the rights and using identity terms that are not acceptable to the peoples concerned, which is sometimes disparaging, disrespectful, and so forth. Issues of self-government also came up in the discussions, and of course the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which we are very concerned that the signals so far that we have received from the Office of the President of the General Assembly have not been clear enough on some sort of a roadmap whereby indigenous participation is effective, is equal in the roadmap to starting to draft the outcome document that will emerge from the World Conference in September. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I'd now like to call on Ms. Tauli-Corpuz. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will just pick up from where Raja Devashish Roy left. I would like to say that it's really a good thing that the Asian dialogue has been held this morning, and I think the statements presented by the panelists as well as those who spoke from the floor clearly has shown that while Asia is the region which is emerging very fast in terms of economic growth, there is still a lot of disparity as far as indigenous peoples are concerned. The economic growth that is resulting in increasing investments of the emerging rich countries in Asia has not only affected indigenous peoples within the region in terms of displacement from their lands, in terms of building huge infrastructures like mega hydroelectric dams and highways that run through the forests and territories of indigenous peoples, and therefore has displaced and further marginalized indigenous peoples. So it's not just a matter of the indigenous peoples in the region affected, but also indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, whether in Africa, in Latin America, and even in the Arctic. They also are now being affected by the investments coming in from the excess money, surplus incomes and growth of the rich countries in Asia. So we are saying that we need to really work more closely with our government to be able to really enter into a dialogue so that the kind of development that's happening within the countries is a development that includes indigenous peoples and not further marginalizes the indigenous peoples. We believe that indigenous peoples who still have sustained many of the remaining forests, remaining ecosystems and mangroves that are in the region. These are the contributions of indigenous peoples in addressing the crisis of climate change. And if their rights, our rights to continue protecting our lands and territories and resources, if these rights are violated blatantly, then there is no hope, not just for us, but also for the whole world, who really relies a lot on these resources to be able to mitigate climate change, but also to ensure more sustainable development in the country level. So we think that there is much to gain by engaging actively in a dialogue between indigenous peoples, the governments, and the private sector for us to be able to define more clearly what is the different path of development that we should take so that our rights will not continue to be violated, so that we will continue to sustain the ecosystems which will allow us to mitigate as well as adapt and be resilient to the impacts of environmental devastation and climate change. And that will also allow us to continue practicing our diverse cultures and diverse traditional knowledge systems that can really provide the solutions to many of the world's problems. And as an incoming special rapporteur for indigenous peoples, I would really like to stress that I would plead with the Asian states to allow me to offer official invitations to me so I can visit the communities of indigenous peoples, especially in situations where human rights violations are happening, and also to allow for develop spaces jointly with the governments to really engage in that sustained dialogue. Finally, we also reiterated, as Devashish Roy has said, that we really are appealing to the Asian states to support us in our endeavor to make the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples meaningful and come up with recommendations that will change the lives of indigenous peoples, and to allow for equal participation of indigenous peoples with states in developing the conclusions and recommendations for this process. The last point that I stressed in my intervention is the fact that we know that many of these countries have not identified, they don't identify or recognize the identity of indigenous peoples. But I think that's something that needs to be addressed in a very serious way, because there are many peoples who recognize, who want to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an instrument to address the problems that they are facing. And whether they are called indigenous peoples or not by the governments, they still suffer from these problems addressed in the declaration, and that has to be facilitated and adhered to by the governments of the region. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Tauli-Corpuz. And I'd now like to call on Mr. Yamnan.
I just wanted to carry forward from Dr. Devashish Roy. One of the key issues that comes up in the Asia Half Day discussion is the existing and also emerging pattern of human rights violation, particularly on the context of the violation of right to self-determination for many of the indigenous communities across Asia. So we have the case of, like in Northeast India, where there is an ongoing movement for self-determination. In the case of Manipur, in the case of Nagaland, for example, there is an military response and also a militarization, which is more to subdue the indigenous people's movement for right to self-determination. There, in our situation, where what we find is like there is also an application of extraordinary or emergency legislation which contravenes the international human rights laws and also humanitarian laws. And also in other situations, like Chittagong Hill Tract, where Devashish is also from there is a case of the violation of the peace accord, where there is a political settlement, within the indigenous community and also with the government. So there are cases, and also the ongoing militarization process, and subsequent human rights violation and persistence of impunity. So those are the violation that comes up from the emergency legislations, extraordinary legislation that derogate the non-derogable right, like right to life, And in our context, we have an act called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1958, which allows full-scale deployment of the Indian Army in indigenous territory, and which led to extensive militarization. And when you have an extensive militarization in indigenous community, it led to so many impacts. It's not just about the civil right violation of targeting the right to life or extrajudicial execution, but then it also led to intrusion into the community fabric of, and also the violation of the cultural right, and also have an impact on the rights of women, children, youth, So it's a multiplying impact. And the second aspect that comes out strongly in the several presentations in the half-day discussion is again the development aggression, what you call the aggressive push for large-scale infrastructure projects, like big dams, then hydroelectric power projects, the oil exploration mining project, the plantation, which are being pursued in the name of national development, fostering economic growth. So this has become a key process which even threatened the survival of several indigenous community. Like in our case, we have like Northeast India, there we have the Brahmaputra and Barak river system where there are more than 200 mega dams which are being pursued aggressively. And these are kind of initiatives which will completely undermine our rights and also lead to, because some of the indigenous community are so small, it will lead to complete extinction and survival because of the demographic impact and also the infusion of capital, and also the militarization which has been already strong, significant in our because of the armed conflict and also the moment of self-determination. Even the military are being used to protect the corporate interests, the private parties which have been increasingly been active in terms of trying to extract, destroy our land and resources. So these are some of the specific two key issues that comes out, and some of the recommendation that comes out during the presentation is more about so in this context to ensure that indigenous peoples are able to assert their right to self-determination, which is also in consonance with the key provision of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And because for us, we feel that unless and until we have the right to self-determination, unless and until we are able to assert our own right over our own land, or able to decide, what kind of development we want, what kind of political institution or political process we want, we will have we'll have no future at all. So that is some of the key recommendation. And then there's another specific recommendation is to rethink the development, the current development model, which is based on corporate, profit and corporate private sector-led kind of development. So there is a call to rethink, to take the free plan from consent of indigenous community and also to recognize their inherent right over the land and resources. So those are some of the specific recommendations that has come out from most of the intervention today. So I will conclude here, and if there are any questions, please feel free. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our guests will now take your questions. Please introduce yourself when posing your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Waldo from Prensa Latina. I have two questions. First one, we share your expectation concerning the meeting that is taking place right now here at UN headquarters. And the second one concerning the post-2015 develop agenda. I want to know, do you believe that indigenous issues should be included as priority, and how can it help to change your current problems? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I'll tackle the second question that you raised. We have been very actively engaged in the post-2015 development agenda process, as well as the open-ended work on sustainable development goals. And we have actively put into the table and talked to the governments about the need to really ensure that human rights-based approach can really be reaffirmed in the post-2015 development goals, and that when we supported all the different items, but we specifically identified targets and indicators that are relevant for indigenous people. So, for instance, in the poverty theme, eradication of poverty, we specifically stated that we need to redefine also poverty, not just to be defined in terms of dollars, $1 per day or $2 per day, but really how the well-being of indigenous peoples in terms of their sustainable livelihoods being supported, as well as in terms of their cultures and traditional knowledge systems being reinforced. We think that the post-2015 development agenda is going to be meaningful for us. It will be relevant for us if it really truly reflects the need to respect our rights enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and affirms and really strengthens the systems, our governance systems, as well as our traditional knowledge systems, which has allowed us to continue saving the remaining ecosystems in this world. We believe that we have a contribution to make, and the UN and the dominant society will really lose a lot if they don't look at these contributions and give the necessary support for these contributions to be further strengthened.
Thank you. Mr. Roy?
I'll add a few points on the post-2015 development agenda and then move on to the expectations a bit. Yes, absolutely agree with Vicky that this $1, $1.50, whatever, doesn't make sense in many remote communities. Once when our former member of parliament and we visited an area affected by food scarcity, and he gave some money, and the headman was saying, "Sir, thank you very much, we cannot eat money." Because the carrying cost of food grain there is like so many cents per kilo that actually the cost of living there may be higher than a city. So and connected with that is the whole question of nutritional security. What are you eating? What were you used to eating? What diseases are affecting you? And the whole questions of health care in remote communities, nomadic communities, and other indigenous communities. Mother mortality and infant mortality amongst the highest. And for that, the usual healthcare system of most countries cannot address that. So these have to be mainstreamed into the national health system so that you have different approaches to dealing with the needs of mothers, infants, persons with disability, and so forth. And with regard to the expectations, one of the main things that we expect out of Permanent Forum meetings is actually a better working relationship with the UN agencies. Of course, that does not include the developed world, where we also have many indigenous communities which are almost as poor or excluded as in the developing countries. But anyway, for the moment, usually they work in developing countries, and we want to have a closer relationship at the country level. So recently, some of us from the different regions went to see the Secretary General, and we put this thing to him. One is that for the UN country teams, the UN presence in the countries, to facilitate dialogues between the UN system and the country levels and indigenous peoples. And secondly, to have a tripartite, to facilitate meetings with the indigenous peoples and their governments. Otherwise, they can't usually have access at high policy-making levels. For example, to deal with pressing issues of health policies, education policies, water policies, and so forth. And we also asked the Secretary General that, could you please talk to the UN resident coordinators in the countries, that they are sensitive to the indigenous peoples about their identity, about their integrity, and also to help the UN country teams talk to each other. There are similar examples in Nicaragua or Guatemala with Chittagong Hill Tracts, or Northeast India, or Mindanao and Philippines. And a lot of this, the experience that is generated is not shared. So it's like reinventing wheels all over the time. So the right hand is not talking to the left hand and so forth. So we are hoping that the Secretary General will address some of these issues, and we also want to have high-level policy dialogues with the heads of UN agencies, which has not happened very much with the forum.
Thank you. Another question. Matthew.
Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing, and sorry to get here late. It's juggling a lot of things, but I wanted to ask, if you can, this issue of the World Conference. I've been trying to figure out, now that the Permanent Forum is meeting, where it stands with the PGA or with the regional groups in terms of the conference actually happening. And then on the issue of Chittagong Hill Tracts, I know before there's been an issue of kind of militarization, the idea that the same thing possibly elsewhere. Do you think that the UN should consider sort of the activities of militaries with regard to indigenous people before taking them into UN peacekeeping, or somehow use the leverage that they have to try to get at this issue? And if so, how should they do it? Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, in relation to the World Conference, we heard the President of the General Assembly speak on Monday, and he said that he will continue having the interactive dialogues, but he didn't give a very specific date on when this is going to happen. So everybody is left hanging, because people have booked their tickets to leave after the 28th because they were expecting that something is happening next on the third week, and we don't have yet any clear signal that that's going to happen. Secondly, there are also all these rumors flying around that it's the Asian governments who are blocking the process. And we talked to the Asian governments, in China specifically, spoke today and said they fully support the participation of indigenous peoples, that the WCIP will continue, and that there should be participation of indigenous peoples in the processes. So I think from my own point of view, there is really some kind of effort to sort of spread all these stories about why it cannot continue, but these are all false information. And I think the PGA has to be very firm and make a decision and say, we continue with this, we schedule the interactive dialogues, we hold the consultations jointly between governments and indigenous peoples, and then jointly develop the recommendations that will be brought before the World Conference. I think that's what we are looking for, and we hope that the President of the General Assembly, as well as the states, really will come across and provide that kind of atmosphere for us, so it will be a meaningful conference.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Roy.
With regard to the World Conference, of course, we want that indigenous peoples should be in the co-driver's seat. And you look at how the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. Of course, it was the General Assembly. But there was a clear understanding that this would be adopted with the consent of indigenous peoples, and which happened. So it's a very similar thing, but with the UN Declaration, we had 20 plus years of dialogue and consultations with special working groups. Here, if we have the interactive hearing, the first leg of the WCIP process, you have hardly 2.5 months in September to have the roundtable discussions and the other the World Conference meetings. So the most important thing for the World Conference is an outcome document. A chair's summary or the chair's text doesn't really bind the UN system in that way. It's just a summary of who said what then. But an outcome document concentrating on best practices and so forth to implement the UN Declaration at the country levels, and of course as high level as possible. But for that, for indigenous participation, what indigenous peoples from different parts of the world have proposed is to appoint 2 advisors to the President of the General Assembly. The states' advisors have already been appointed, 2 of them. So we have asked for 2 indigenous persons to be appointed, so that these 4 can consult states and indigenous peoples and help the President of the General Assembly, the PGA, to start the zero draft of the outcome document, and from June onwards has a substantive discussion on what is going to be in the draft, in the outcome document. But if this does not happen, then I don't think indigenous peoples will be happy to go on in a process of a World Conference where you will just have some summaries and the chairperson's text, and that doesn't give a lot of substance. So we are concerned, and we do hope. We heard that some governments in Africa and Asia had difficulties. But if they could adopt the UN Declaration with indigenous consent, ultimately the General Assembly will do it. So it will be states and indigenous peoples working together. And we hope that the governments will come forward and the PGA will show a leadership. And quickly on the hill tracks and other areas where there are militarized, these concerns continue. And of course, if any forces from these countries participate in international peacekeeping, we would certainly want them that they should also honor and respect human rights in their own countries.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just briefly on the militarization, because it differs from one country to another, and also the state of political processes differs from one country. Like in the Chittagong Hill Tract, there is already an agreement to demilitarize the area. The only thing is like they don't militarize. So there is a diverse way of making sure that it happens. So peace, ensuring that the peacekeepers comply to human rights before that's one of the way. But in other contexts, like in our context where there is an ongoing conflict, so what you call is a full-scale withdrawal of the armed conflict, of the armed forces, So and to fully comply with all the international humanitarian law, human rights instruments. So that's more of our priority, So of course the peacekeeping is there, but then we don't, So it differs from one country to another, and depends on the political context. Yeah, and yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, Madam, please.
And Charles, Baltic Review. On May 13, the forum member from Estonia, Oliver Lode, said that the situation in Crimea was today perhaps the most urgent global indigenous issue. Keeping in mind that the Crimean Tatars are required now to apply for resident permits, and if they do not want to take up the citizenship of the occupier, they would be declared illegal aliens on their own indigenous lands. Can you tell us how this move violates the Indigenous Peoples Declaration, whether in Crimea or different parts of Asia?
Well, definitely it violates the rights of the Crimea Tatars people. They have a long history of being displaced from their own ancestral territories. You know, since 200 years ago, they were displaced, and then they were brought back during when Ukraine became independent, and now they are going to be displaced again from their territories. And I think that's really a very gross violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says that Crimea Tatars identify as indigenous peoples. They should have the rights to their lands, territories, and resources, and they have the right to self-determination, to determine their political status vis-a-vis the state. You know, that's Article 3, and now they don't have any possibility to determine what their political status is vis-a-vis Russia, nor vis-a-vis the Ukraine government. I think that is really a very tragic story of how indigenous peoples all over the world are being treated that way, and I hope the UN can really do something to stop that kind of process happening, which basically kills the identities of indigenous peoples by depriving them of their access and use of their lands, and also depriving them of the right to determine whether they want to belong to that state or not. You know, that's really what the key violations are, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Yes, please, Mr. Roy.
Yes, I agree with Vicky that this is a matter of serious concern. We remember Crimean Tatars coming to the Permanent Forum and other UN bodies speaking about their rights, and now the situation is really, really bad, and the UN system should do something about them. But the Crimean Tatar situation also really illustrates the problems many indigenous peoples face in other parts of the world. And to me, what is the most important definition of indigenous peoples? The answer is those peoples who never had any role in designing the architecture of your state. So what roof are you going to live in? Are we living on the veranda, or in a little sort of hut next to the main building, or in a small room? And the state is imposed on us without our choice. And you look at the national constitutions of most countries, apart from Latin America and the Philippines, and in the last 10, 15 years, ask indigenous peoples how many words of the national constitutions they wrote, and they will probably say none. And so this is the whole challenge, that that states respect the self-determination rights of each of these people to determine the nature of the relationship with the state. You have your foreign affairs, you have your security and all that, but land, health, education and all. Why should not the people determine those priorities and culture and their identity?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us today, and thank all of you for coming. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.